Well, thank you all for coming. Hopefully you're here in the right room. My name is Brian Gracely. I'm Director of Strategy for the OpenShift team. My gentleman to my left is Chris Houseknecht, who's Principal Engineer at Ansible. I think he was, employee number 2 or 3, so knows the Ansible stuff cold from back when, what you say, you guys were building that in somebody's living room with whiteboards and...
That's right, in the founder's living room.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about containers. We're going to talk a little bit about DevOps. We're going to talk a little bit about digital transformation, trying to work all those things in. Thank you for everybody for coming today. Feel free to ask questions throughout. We'll do our best to sort of answer them as they go, or we'll stick around and answer them afterwards if they're longer questions or you have some things that are real specific in details. And if we don't see you because of the bright lights, just keep your hands up and we'll get to you at some point in time. So this is what we're going to try and cover. Give you some sense of why we're hearing about modern business success, why speed is such an important component of that. We're going to talk a little bit about what digital transformation means for companies that aren't necessarily greenfield startups out of Silicon Valley. We're going to talk a little bit about how do you match the technology transformation with what has to happen around people and process and so forth. And then obviously we're going to talk about how containers fits into this story and DevOps fits into this story. If at some point you miss a slide that you need to take a picture of, just let me know. I'll flip back real quick. So let me kind of put a definition around this, just because digital transformation means like DevOps, like cloud, like whatever. It means whatever you sort of want it to mean sometimes. I like to put it in the context of what real customers are doing. We tried this week very hard to give you a sense of what some of those companies were doing, so it wasn't just Red Hat giving you another definition. At the core of what these digital transformations tend to mean is we're moving the impact of technology from being purely an IT thing about saving cost, about connecting people, about digitizing data and getting out of the analog business. It's really becoming more of something is changing in people's business. And the opportunity to apply technology there to either deliver a service faster, create a better user experience, better understand the data around what's happening to make a more informed decision, an automated decision. That's what's really driving this. And if you listen to the companies that have been talking all week, and we'll give you some examples of those, what they're really talking about is this speed is about affecting the top line, right? We're talking about revenue. We're talking about the things that the folks in the suits around your companies are going to be going, that's important to me. It's a little bit different technology conversation than we've had for a long time around IT, which was always make it go faster, make it go cheaper. This is going to be much more around how do I make the business grow, how do I impact a better customer experience, and so forth. So as we look at this from a technology perspective, you may have seen this image throughout. It's impacting this along a bunch of different sort of vectors, if you will, right? It's impacting, we're seeing people trying to develop software faster. So we're seeing this transformation from, waterfall. Somebody sits down, writes up a business plan, writes up a project plan, tries to fit everything in for 6 months, and then 18 months later, you hope that your crystal ball was perfect, and when it popped out, we're seeing people go, that doesn't really work. Jim talked about it yesterday in his keynote. The concept of long-range planning is having to get chunked down into smaller range types of planning. We're seeing people, adopt Agile. We're seeing people adopt DevOps. We see it in the application space. These other things all sort of move in parallel. We're seeing it in the application space where people are taking larger chunks of applications, big monolithic applications, in some cases distributing them, in some cases breaking them up. Nowadays we're hearing people talk about microservices. Interesting sort of tidbit about this. I get a chance to attend a lot of these events. I get a lot of people now that are coming up to me, and you'll be talking to them about whatever, DevOps or microservices or containers, and you go, are you guys down that path at all? And they go, yeah, we're moving things to microservices. They're not too micro, right? Which means people love the idea of adopting the buzzword because it helps you sort of move past your boss showing up to this and going, hey, are we doing microservices? But the idea of getting into really tiny little finite chunks of code that are going to then be orchestrated and interconnected is a longer process. So if you're down the path of making your applications a little more agile, but you feel like, maybe they're not small enough to be microservices, don't worry about it. You're in the same boat as a lot of people. From a deployment and packaging perspective, we're seeing this transformation from virtual servers virtual machines over the last decade roughly, to more and more people going, that made sense to a certain extent. It still was sort of a heavy packaging exercise. Containers are becoming an interesting technology in terms of developers are very interested in them because I can develop on my laptop, I can package things on my laptop, I can make sure they run in some sort of structured way, and then I can pass off that artifact in a consistent way over to dev and test. I can get it through my CI pipelines, and the operations team can then take that and run it in a well-orchestrated way. So we're seeing containers more and more becoming that sort of common bond between how developers think about packaging their application and how operations wants to run them. The other thing we're seeing around containers is we're seeing more and more use cases. So they're moving from strictly greenfield applications, just new microservices, to seeing people say, it ran well on Linux before, I can potentially lift and shift that into a container. In some cases, it's an anti-pattern, but we're seeing that happen, and people are getting fairly good results in terms of ROI, in terms of better performance, better productivity, and so forth. And then obviously, you can't come to an event these days and not talk about cloud. I think what we're seeing more and more with people is they're coming to the realization that being bound, sort of bounding my business to wherever I physically put a building that has 4 walls, lots of power, lots of racks and cooling, sometimes can be fairly limiting. And so they're beginning to look at what's going on in the public cloud. They're hearing more and more that it's trustworthy in terms of security, and they're trying to figure out, how do I better leverage this sort of infinite set of global resources to potentially help where it makes sense. So you can't come to an event pretty much anywhere where you don't hear about these companies, right? You got to make sure your company's not going to get Ubered, your company's not going to get Airbnb'd, you're not going to get Netflixed. Those guys do nothing but microservices, and it's all DevOps. Interesting story about all 3 of these, and when the slides go up, there'll be notes in there. Every one of these, if you go back and look at the history of them, while they dominate conference talks and stuff, every one of them up to some point was a giant monolith. Every one of them had some business critical application or their platform that was a giant monolith, exactly like a lot of you, right? And so what they eventually evolved to, just because of the nature of their business, the scale of their business, was I have to get faster, I have to grow user base faster, I have to add features faster, I have to get better customer experience. And they've sort of been the pioneers of driving towards these faster things. How do I break up a monolithic application, turn it into microservices? But even the ones that we talk about and sort of deify sometimes started off having the same sort of challenges that a lot of you have in terms of monoliths, in terms of how do I scale development teams, how do I scale operations. So I like to sort of break these down as those folks, the Airbnbs and the Ubers and the Netflix are really, they're kind of the unicorns. They've sort of shaped things, but more so is what's interesting about these people that are evolving. And these are 5 cases of companies that you could have heard about here if you want to go back and look at them. Volvo, KeyBank, BMW, Swiss Rail, Amadeus. And the thing that you're going to find in every one of these stories, and I'll touch on them a little bit, is every one of them, something changed in their business. And something changed, some of it they controlled, some of it was sort of outside of their control, it was in their ecosystem somewhere, or the customer behavior around how they interact with them changed. And their digital transformation is all about, how do I adapt to that? So let me give you a couple of examples. So in the case of Volvo, Volvo basically said, look, we're in the business of making cars and selling cars. The car buying process there's 2 parts. There's the part that you fall in love with your car for whatever reason. You love the color, you love the shape, you love the power. And then there's the miserable part of going to the car dealership and haggling with somebody and feeling like, I'm just not getting a good enough price. So in Volvo's case, they said, look, I don't necessarily directly control the dealer experience, right? And in fact, the dealer experience is getting radically disrupted without them by things like TrueCar and Kelley Blue Book and all these other things that when you walk into the dealership, you're much smarter than you were 5 years ago. You've got a price that you know you're going to want to pay. So in their case, they said, look, I need to focus on the other half of the equation. I need to make it so you love the vehicle, but I want to make it so that you are going to love the vehicle before you even have to get to the dealership. So their focus was all about, how do I not just give you stock photos, for example, on the website, but I let you feel like you're in the car. You get sort of that virtual new car smell. You can spin the car around. You can look at it from 360 degrees. And what that drove for them was a huge focus on customer experience, which is going to be their web front end. But also, if you're going to be doing that, and your device your new sort of pseudo car dealership is this thing. I've got to be able to put that data closer to you regardless of where you are. So we're seeing them move their environments into running OpenShift on top of Azure, about 4 different locations around the globe, as well as their own data center, and picking up applications like, in their case, they picked up WebSphere, modernized the WebSphere a little bit, containerized it, because they had all this business logic that was on the back end of what was going to be the car that you ordered, containerized that, and they're able to run that in OpenShift. So again, the focus there is not, I want to save 20% like you typically hear, it's I want to change my user experience, right? KeyBank, the one in the middle, KeyBank's an interesting thing. You think about what's the most important thing that most individual users do with your bank? It's the place where your paycheck goes every other Friday or every Friday. So in their case, you have this, their business is run around Fridays. So one fifth of their calendar is most of their business. And what they found was as they moved from having a web front end to how people would check their banking and so forth to a mobile front end, that level of anxiety of if my paycheck is going to be there every Friday, actually they found grew. They found they were getting 10 times the number of clicks to see if their money was there because you didn't do it from your work desktop anymore. You might be worried about who's looking over your shoulder. You were just looking at it from your phone. So they now all of a sudden have sort of a web scale problem. I've got 20% of my business is on one day and it's growing 10x, right? So I've got to be able to scale that. They moved their banking application over onto OpenShift. They wanted to take advantage of what Kubernetes does, so that sort of pseudo web scale, dealing with how do I schedule containers. And in their case, that's how they're scaling for this sort of periodic peaks and valleys. I'll talk about one last one, and the other ones, you can find these elsewhere just from the sake of time. Happy to talk about them afterwards. Amadeus, the one on the bottom right, you may have seen them in the keynote. They were, I think, Innovation and Winner of the Year last year. They're a company who is in the airline industry. They're basically, anytime you book a hotel, a car, an airline, they're on the back end helping all the companies give you all that data. And in their case, they went from when you used to, way back in the day, call to make some sort of travel arrangement, you went through a travel agent. There might be 50 or so transactions that went on in terms of looking up pricing, comparing pricing, seeing if those routes and fares are what you want. They're now seeing upwards of 40, 50, 80,000 transactions that go on to do all of this sort of parallel scanning of stuff. So if your business all of a sudden has a 2000x scaling problem, what do? Right? Well, in some cases, in their case, they're going to focus on that user experience, but they're going to focus on getting their applications into smaller form factors, containerizing it, running it. They use OpenShift because they basically said, look, we now have sort of a Google scale, somewhat Google scale technology challenge. We want to leverage that technology. And they're another one that runs some of it in their own data center, but more so they're running OpenShift on top of Amazon and on top of Azure, I think mostly on top of Amazon. So this sort of hybrid cloud story, there's a reality to it. And there's more and more examples of companies like that, but the focus of this is it's changing my user experience, it's changing sort of the economics of what's going on in my business, and the need to go faster and the need to be able to sort of scale when you need to is really critical to that. So I always kind of break this down. People ask, the question that people always ask is like, okay, that's great. How do I get there, right? And the first thing, if you're going to start with how do I get there, is let's start with sort of a map or a framework for what it looks like. And if you're one of those disruptive companies, your business looks a little bit like the thing on the left, where the thing you're focusing on is mostly emerging customer trends, right? So if you're Uber, you're only focused on sort of that mobile experience. You don't have to think about web. You don't have to think about some old payment model. You're using nothing but digital payments, for example. Your business platform you're building off of a business platform. You built one core business platform. It's mostly going to be mobile and web. It may just be mobile. If you're Instagram, for example, it's just mobile. And the back end of that is sort of this very specially built data analytics thing, right? And then the way you operate that is, developers, DevOps, and SREs, right? You're hiring people that are specifically looking for that stuff. So a lot of greenfield, a lot of sort of what's new and modern. If you're one of these transforming companies, which I would assume in most cases is most of the people that are here, your model looks a little different, right? You're mixing both existing customer trends and legacy customer trends, new and emerging. Talked to an insurance company yesterday who still told me that if I want to get insurance from them, I have to fill out paperwork, and about 3 weeks later, they'll tell me if I'm insured, right? That still goes on. They're dealing with a mix of both mobile and web because, again, your customer base is large, but you're having to deal with both of those environments. You've got a bunch of different business platforms, right? The things that are going to help you deal with that. You've got a lot of different data silos, and you're dealing with, has anybody ever heard of Conway's Law? Conway's Law basically says, however your org chart looks, that's exactly how you'll build systems. There's this parallel between how you're used to communicating and how you're going to build back-end systems, because the organizational sort of friction of going, oh, my system looks like how we work. The challenge to that is you're focused on what our internal organization is optimized for, not organized around how do I deliver something for my customer, a better user experience, better data, whatever that might be. And so the trick becomes, how do I get from what looks like the things on the right to more like what looks like the things on the left, right? That's the question that everybody seems to ask. So let's see how we get there. So real quick, this is what most companies sort of deal with. 70% of my portfolio, maybe a little more, legacy stuff. You may have some projects that are evolving, and then you've got a sliver of what you're doing that's sort of new, right? This isn't unusual. You can tweak the colors a little bit, but this is ultimately the challenge that sort of every CIO has. Most of my money goes into that brown slice on the pie. Not enough of it goes into the green slice. Every vendor tells you that the money you're going to save in the brown slice is going to help you for the green slice, but how do you go about doing that? So what we're going to try and give you guys is a little bit of a framework for how we're seeing those companies, those evolving companies, how they're doing this. And I'm going to hand off to Chris here in just a second. So we tend to see it, and this is sort of the pattern that we're seeing. We see this in sort of 4 pieces, and this is by no means kind of fully complete, but we see this pattern quite a bit. We see people who say, look, the easiest thing I can do, the starting point, the low-hanging fruit is, how do I automate today's applications, right? So before I get into microservices, before I break up a monolith, before we DevOps, whatever that means, how do I automate these things so that at a minimum, I'm building some process around going faster, and I'm building some tools and technologies around going faster, right? The second thing is we tend to see people move towards this sort of DevOps evolution, right? This realization that you can't have a huge impedance mismatch between the thing that you want to deploy and your ability to deploy that, right? The third thing that we see, and sometimes these are slightly in different orders, is as this is going along, they're making that platform decision, right? They're looking at, do I have a platform that's going to be capable of going faster, scaling, and dealing with the stuff I have to deal with? And then finally, once those platform decisions tend to be made, and those platform decisions sometimes are, am I on-prem, am I in the cloud, those types of things, is we see people begin to say, I can now package those applications in new ways, I can develop in new ways, containerize them. In some cases, I'm building around modern frameworks, modern microservices, and leveraging more modern platforms for going about doing that. So I'm going to hand off real quick to Chris. Chris is going to talk about kind of how we get the Ansible piece, the automation piece of this up and running and making that piece successful.
So how many folks here today are using Ansible at your company? Wow, a lot of people. Hopefully I won't bore you with what I'm going to talk about. Change the slide here. So it turns out we can accelerate the journey from where we're at today to reaching that digital transformation where we want to be using the power of automation. And when we think about automation, there's sort of 4 patterns or areas that we focus on. And I think the tendency is to think about these things in silos. But I would argue that they're very interconnected, right? And starting with existing applications. There was 2 slides ago, Brian was saying that 70% of the application portfolio tends to be legacy or existing. So think of the 80-20 rule. That's our 20%. If we can start to automate that, that's a huge win, right? And when we start to automate that, there's this natural progression into DevOps. And Brian said earlier, use DevOps like a verb, like when we DevOps. That's kind of funny. But when we start to get our teams, our developers, and our operators speaking the same language, speaking in an automation language, it starts to break down those barriers to communication, and we start to see DevOps unfold in more of a natural way. Now imagine if my legacy applications, I can describe those with an automation tool such that when we provision new resources, we're doing that with code. Or we're able to do deployments in an automated fashion so that they're more consistent, they're more reliable. And imagine if I can describe the pieces in the application stack in a way that's done in code, in a way that's done with variables and templates, right? Now imagine that my people are working together in a more cohesive way. When it comes time to introduce containers, that new technology, it's going to be a whole lot easier, right? And if I start to, if it's easier now to move my existing applications into containers, the natural outgrowth of that is, hey, we've got all these containers we're building. We need a platform to orchestrate and manage this. And so there's this natural progression into a container platform, and it's a whole lot less painful. So the question is, how does Ansible help in these areas? And the word that comes to mind for me when I thought about this is simplicity. You know, Ansible, it's a feature-complete tool, but it's simple in the sense I don't have to install agents all over my infrastructure. So it's simple to get started. If you opened up a playbook, which is the automation artifact, if you will, from Ansible, it's written in a declarative, sort of natural language syntax called YAML. So again, it's simple to pick it up and start automating things with it. It's also simple for an outsider, a new person, or a non-technical person to not only get started, but also to open up an existing playbook and understand what it's doing. So that's why I say, you know, simplicity came to mind. And how does that apply to each of these four areas? Well, you know, because of its simplicity, Ansible can be applied to your existing applications in a small way. We can start out small. We can start out at the bottom of the stack. You know, we don't have to automate everything all at once. We don't have to touch every process all at once. We don't necessarily have to train everybody in our organization how to Ansible. You know, think about, we can do configuration management and manage configuration drift with Ansible. That's an easy place to start. The next time a developer needs a new development environment, you know, rather than handcrafting that, we can have an engineer really, in an easy way, start to automate that process with Ansible. So we can start out small, and that will start to grow through the organization. How that translates into DevOps is because it's such a simple tool to get started with, it's a simple tool to have a victory with. Now what that means is, you know, it's sort of contagious. That when my developers start having victories, the operators want to know what's going on over there. How come those guys are high-fiving? I want some of that. And so it naturally flows across different teams in the organization and opens up that communication. How it applies to containers, we don't just leave you hanging. You know, I think that the thought of, you know, we think of Ansible as traditionally as virtual machines and cloud. We don't really think of it in the container space, maybe. It turns out that we can help take that automation you're using in the legacy side and use that to build containers and images, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then, you know, it naturally leads us into cloud platform, where Ansible is, you know, the installer for OpenShift, and it's, you know, it's Ansible you're going to be using to orchestrate those cloud resources. So that all sounds really simple, right? Why aren't we all doing it? And the reason is, you know, people, point tools, and the pace of innovation. And, you know, how does Ansible help sort of break that down and help get us moving faster? Well, on the people side, you know, we tend to like complicate things, right? We tend to put up the barrier. I don't want to change. We've been doing it this way for the last 15 years. It works. Leave it alone. And, you know, Ansible just kind of does this on its own. And I have sort of an anecdotal story. When I got to the conference center Tuesday morning, I knew, I've been here before, I knew when I came in I could turn to the right and there'd be like a little sort of lounge area. I could hang out for an hour or so, get my laptop out and have some quiet time, get some work done. So I sat down, got my laptop out, and there was a gentleman sitting across from me. We saw each other, we introduced ourselves, and I said, oh yeah, I work for Ansible. He's like, oh, Ansible, we love Ansible. And he said, there was this guy, one of the guys on one of my teams, he tried it out. He was trying to automate something. He found Ansible, wrote a playbook. And he was so excited. Before you know it, his whole team was using it. And now as a company, we're building a proof of concept. So because of that simplicity, it just sort of naturally on its own allows people to have some quick, easy victories and sort of breaks down that people barrier. Point tools. For all you guys that raise your hands out there, you know what I'm talking about. Ansible is not a point tool, right? It's a Swiss Army knife. And as far as pace of innovation, Ansible is backed by a community that is moving fast. There's over 2,600 contributors to the Ansible project. So likely, if you're trying to automate something, it's already been done, or there's somebody already working on it. If something's changed, if an API has changed and we need an update, someone's already on it. It's moving fast. It moves faster than any vendor's release cycle is going to move. So you're not going to be slowed down by that lack of innovation, if you will. So I've talked a lot about Ansible, and it's sort of funny that this slide is my third slide. Maybe we should have started here. But what is Ansible? It's a simple automation language. You've heard me talk about playbooks, right? If you haven't seen it, I guarantee if you go to our Getting Started guide, you can be running and automating something literally within 10 minutes. At its heart, it's an automation engine that runs the playbooks. And Tower, I haven't mentioned Tower yet. Tower is an enterprise framework that sits on top of Ansible and provides a web console and an API. So sort of continuing the themes that I've been talking about, simple, powerful, agentless. I think I've kind of hammered home why it's so simple, right? It's that simple to get started. The language is declarative. It's almost like a natural language. It uses YAML. So it's easy to pick it up and get going with it. Powerful. It's feature complete. And it's powerful for a few reasons. I like to say that the batteries are included. You don't have to be a programmer, right? Ansible sort of abstracts away all of the complexities of cloud APIs or service APIs or what network appliances and things, right? You don't have to be a programmer and know how to make REST calls to deploy something on EC2, for example. So that's really the power that's there, as well as the power of the community that I mentioned before. There's 2,600 contributors. If you look out on the open source project, I think there's like over 7,000 forks. That's pretty powerful. And agentless. There's no, you can get started on your laptop. You can get started in your development environment. You don't have to go run to security and get special permissions. So in that sense, Ansible gets out of the way. I mentioned modules, over 950 of them. You'll notice that Windows is in the center. We've been doing a lot of work on the Windows front. So Ansible runs on a control node, runs on Linux, but we can use WinRM to now do a lot to manage Windows machines with PowerShell and things. All of the big cloud providers are up there. We've done a ton of work in virtualization in the container space, as I mentioned. Networking, we've done some amazing things there. It's now possible to automate the configuration of routers and switches and all those network devices, and we're actually able to make it so for the first time, network engineers can abstract that configuration that they normally go out, log into a switch and manually change, which is going to be very error prone, abstract that away into almost like a database. Right? So we've separated the act of applying configuration from the configuration, and it's really powerful. And if you're looking to start to enable chat ops, all those notification modules are going to help you do that. So I think of this slide as sort of the Ansible stack. And at the bottom is the Ansible engine, the open source automation engine. If you're not familiar, check it out on GitHub. Under the Ansible namespace, there's an Ansible project. And we've talked about how that automation engine brings about simplicity, it's powerful, it's agentless. And then on top of that is Tower. So Tower is that enterprise framework that sits on top of Ansible, and it gives you things like the ability to create jobs, schedule those jobs. It gives you an audit trail to see who did what and when. It gives you a really cool dashboard to see how fast things are running, what's running, what the history of things is, and then delegation. Imagine if your operators, when they automate the process of creating a new environment, kind of a complicated thing, right? Making VMs and standing up databases and all that stuff. Imagine if they could just hand that over to the developers and make that a click button automation. And that's what Tower is able to do, and that's what delegation's all about. So I mentioned earlier that Ansible's done a lot of work in the container space, and we've been working for the past year on a project called Ansible Container. Also, it's an open source project on GitHub, so I encourage you to check it out. The idea is, that investment you're making on automating your legacy applications and all of that work that you're doing, the tooling that you're building, those playbooks, roles, why can't we use those to build container images? And so that's what Ansible Container enables. So instead of writing Docker files, which are essentially shell scripts, let's use Ansible, let's use a playbook, let's use roles. And not only that, what if I could orchestrate this thing on my laptop while I'm doing development and then use Ansible to deploy that application into my test environment and into production, deploying it onto OpenShift. So Ansible Container gives you that sort of full lifecycle management. And so that brings us to the holy grail, right? The multi-cloud container deployment. This is where we're trying to get to. We started off with legacy. We've moved into containers. Now it's time to go to the cloud with a platform. And it turns out at the heart of all of this, Ansible's still there. And Ansible's driving the installation of OpenShift. It's driving the management side of that cloud platform. Whether it's Azure, AWS, whether it's private cloud, VMware, Ansible's at the core of that. Whether you're managing with cloud forms, it turns out Ansible, we're embedding capabilities to run playbooks inside of cloud forms, as well as Tower. So what's actually happening, any of you guys that are checking out cloud forms, you'll be able to actually run a playbook, and behind the scenes is like sort of a mini Tower, providing that RESTful API so that cloud forms can fire off the playbook and get back results. So pretty cool. And what I want to leave you with is, if you're evaluating automation tools, Ansible is the tool that's going to grow with you from the very beginning all the way to here. So it's the tool that you're going to use, and it's going to grow with you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brian.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. So I think as we think about that, what did we talk about at the beginning? Businesses are trying to go faster. They're trying to create better user experiences. We're trying to do the same thing in terms of giving you the tools that you need. If you take anything away from what's going on around with Ansible, it's the simplest in terms of your learning experience, your ramp-up time to getting to automation. Automation is going to be that thing that's going to give you the ability to do things very consistently, right? Take that time out of doing repetitive tasks. Do it in a secure way because you're going to be doing it consistently. You're going to be doing it where you're not going to make nearly as many mistakes because it's not a complicated tool. And it's a tool that you're going to see used across where you're going, from automating things to helping to build containers to helping to deploy that platform that's going to help the business go quickly. And then once you start to get towards moving away from say VM infrastructure, some of your legacy applications, containers come into play. And we really sort of focus around 4 areas about how to make containers be a relevant part of this conversation. Obviously, there's a container platform story. So how do I make sure that when I have containers and I'm going to be running hundreds of applications, thousands of applications, I've got a framework for doing that? How do we go about thinking about these new types of applications? So you hear people writing in new languages. They're writing in Spring, Vertex, Go, a bunch of different things. How do I make sure that I have that framework in place, embedded with the platform to do that? How do I do this across multiple clouds? And then how do I do some of the things that people are doing around business innovation? The thing about this is not a single technology conversation. This is not a single group conversation. This is something that containers are spanning across the app team and the dev teams. infrastructure teams as well as app dev. And it's also extending across both sort of your technology stack, but it allows you to have a business conversation. Hey, boss, we don't have to be restricted by the resources that are only in our data center. We can spread that across to multiple cloud environments. Hey, boss, we have an environment that if you guys can think up a new idea, one of the keynotes this week said, we go from idea to execution to customer in a couple of days. That's the way they think about things. If you have that framework in place to be able to help with that conversation, you become very, very powerful. So the way we do that, we talked about simplicity of Ansible. In order to get to where we're seeing the Ubers and the Airbnbs and those folks are using some really, really powerful technologies. Some of those technologies are things like standard containers with Docker, Kubernetes, leveraging what Google's put out in the open source domain. Putting these things together sometimes can be complicated. When they're coming out, their new releases are coming out every 2 months, every 3 months. From your perspective, that's not making things easier. So the way that we go about trying to make that easier for you is what we call OpenShift. OpenShift being the container platform that's going to bring all those technologies together. They're going to make sure they're natively wired up from a networking perspective to give you multi-tenancy. They're going to make sure there's multiple levels of security so that the environment is going to be secure and authenticated and encrypted. It's going to make sure that when you want to bring in application services like JBoss, like queuing, like integration services, mobile APIs, those are just going to be natively in the platform. You're going to click on them or you're going to get them through an API. So if you think about this from a progress perspective, we talked about automating things. We talked about getting to a point where containers become part of what you want to do. And then you have the platform in place to go about doing that. And we're trying to help you make that very, very simple to get it deployed and continue to run it. Just some numbers for people, some of the companies that we talked about earlier. This is the things that you take back to your boss. This is the thing to take back to your management team. These technologies are helping to drive really, really important levels of cost savings from a developer perspective, if you want to measure it in that context. The ROI of these platforms is very, very high. And the nice thing is the payback on these are very small, right? All built around open source. You're able to leverage what's going on in the community, so you're going to get rapid return. But these are numbers that come from the customers that we've been showing this week. They've been coming back to us and saying, look, it took us a little while to get there. We had to grow through our people. We had to grow through the technology. But we're reaching that point where the numbers are pretty overwhelming in terms of helping the business. Now, all that's technology, and our job is to give you the tools to go back and make yourself successful. But a lot of times you go, that's great, but how do I organize people? How do I have a framework to help learn more than myself? How do I do that? And we've been talking about community and innovation all week. One of the things that's fairly new for Red Hat that a lot of you ought to look at taking advantage of is something that we call the Open Innovation Labs. And the best way to think about Open Innovation Labs is they're going to help you with that question of how do I go about doing this? Not what do I use, not what tool do I use, but how do I go about doing this? It's a framework that we use. We can deliver it both out of the West Coast as well as here in Boston on the East Coast, but we can also bring it out to your environment. It's a sort of think of it as a virtual type of thing. And the folks are really good at helping you basically say, let's organize some people. Let's take a couple of challenges that you have. Let's take one application space that's a problem. Let's take one business case that's a problem. Could sit for a couple of days, could sit for a couple of weeks with you, and really kind of help blend that thing of what are my people going to look like? How do I get the environments up and running so you're not spending all your time just getting the tools started? But also, how do I think about talking internally about this? How do I market this to my business? How many of you have ever built something or you're in the process of building these platforms and you go, we built the platforms and none of the developers are on here? Anybody running into that challenge? We see that a lot. When people go, we spent all these cycles doing that. Part of that is you kind of have to put your marketing hat on, and that feels unusual for IT folks sometimes to go, look, my job is to nerd out and make the bits work and make sure the lights blink and all that stuff. These guys are very good at helping with that as well. So it's a great sort of addition for us to help you not just have the technology, how to work with the organizations and the community and open source, but how do I make it so that it becomes tangible and you can go run with it, sort of train the trainer, if you will. And again, a bunch of different ways that they can go about helping you do that. Collaborate with you on site, come to our locations. People do residencies. We're seeing people begin to send a team of people with one specific problem. They'll stay for a few weeks. And then we're going to expand this around best practices for communities, just like we've done with the Ansible community, just like we've done with the open source community. So trying to help you along this whole spectrum of the tools, the technology, how to think about the people, and then try and make these technologies as easy as possible so you guys can get up to speed and running with them. Well, thank you all for coming today. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll stick around for a little while if you want to ask some questions.